Hey everybody, Professor Dust here. So in this video, we're going to talk about transformational leadership. Talk about some of its origins and its iterations, and then where we are today, and some of its strengths and criticisms as a construct of leadership. So the idea of transformational leadership actually began first as a construct that was interested in charisma. So charismatic leadership has some earlier literature, and it was based on this definition that you see here, charisma being a special personality characteristic that gives a person superhuman or exceptional powers and is reserved for a few, is of divine origin, and results in the person being treated as a leader. So this idea of charisma, somebody that's larger than life and has the ability to do great things, it harkens back to what we talked about in the trait approach a little bit, and that some people are born with it, and it also has this influence of motivation, that they have this divine capacity to uplift and get people to move in this new, better direction. And so charisma has been discussed in the research, not as much as transformational leadership, which we'll get to in a second, but it is important to understand its foundational role in the idea of transformational leadership. So it was broken down into a few behaviors, and then here are some of the outcomes, in particular its outcomes on its followers. So they are role models, and then in turn, followers tend to trust their ideology or their beliefs wherever they're headed. They do a good job of articulating goals, what the vision is and where they're headed, and then people tend to identify with the leader or the organization because of that articulation. They set high expectations, and in turn people become more emotionally involved, have a higher sense of effective commitment, and then they express confidence in whatever they're trying to do, and that sense of confidence then transfers over to the follower, where they're more likely to go after stretch goals. Okay, so charismatic leadership, sure, it can be potentially helpful in some scenarios, but it has this idea that only some people have that capability, and research would illustrate that if you're not really charismatic and you're trying to fake it, it doesn't necessarily come off very well, and so it's kind of limited in its developmental capacity. And so then Burns came along and talked about charismatic leadership embedded within what's called transformational leadership, but built on it a little bit. And we'll talk about what each one of these three really mean. But then he also branched out and said, hey, there's actually two other related leadership concepts that are important, one being transactional, this idea of some type of exchange as the basis for leader-follower relationships, and then also this idea of pseudo-transformational leadership, which essentially is somebody that is acting in a way that's transformational, but they're really doing it for self-interests. So let's go one by one, talk about each one of these in a little more detail. So transactional leadership, it is what it sounds like. It's that transaction between the leader and the follower. You do this as a follower, and then I will do this for you as the leader. So a few examples, maybe a politician says, I promise to not raise taxes or give you any new taxes, so please vote for me. That's a transaction. As a professor, if you get the correct answer to a question that I ask on an exam, then you get points or you get a specific grade. That's a transaction. Or if I am a sales manager and I tell my sales staff, hey, if you sell 10% more than your quota, then you're going to get a 10% bonus. That's another sense of transaction. Okay, and we'll talk about those being important, and those things are influential in this leader-follower exchange. And then there's transformational leadership, which has some of the same flavors as some of those charismatic leadership behaviors, engaging the followers, making a personal connection with followers, as well as being attentive to their needs and motives, which is a little bit different than charisma, which we'll talk about here in a second, as well as trying to help them reach their full potential, and also focused on a sense of motivation and morals and doing things for the right reason. So we'll break down transformational leadership in a little bit more detail in the next theory, or the next iteration of transformational leadership. But just know at this point, this was the first attempt to try and differentiate charisma from transaction to pseudo-transformational leadership. And then this last one, pseudo-transformational leadership, it is transforming. It's the same types of behaviors. However, this inspiration and personal appeal is essentially there to try and manipulate for self-serving interests of the actual leader. And they're not really interested in independent thought or their followers being developed and growing. It's actually discouraged. They just want them to follow in line with whatever the vision that they are espousing. And then there's really a lack of interest in the well-being. It's really do this because it's what I want you to do, not because it's good for you. So for all those reasons, transformational leadership or pseudo-transformational leadership is problematic. And the hard part is that this is the version that's probably the hardest to really know. Right? You only see from a behavioral standpoint what they're doing and what they're saying, and it may appear to be transformational, but you don't really know what's going on inside their head. Are they really doing it for self-interests? That's up to the perceiver, or that's up to a third party that's trying to decide whether or not they think that is the case. So the next iteration would be called what is called the full range of leadership model, and it has some similarities to transformational and transactional theories, but it really was a more detailed evaluation of all of what I would call the dimensions or the factors of those different traits. So we'll talk about each one of these in a second. This is just a nice visual of all these different dimensions within the transformational and the transactional. So let's talk about the full range leadership model, which is still used today. It's quite prevalent. So for the transformational leadership construct, right, and I'll go back to this last slide, right? So we're here, the 4 I's. This is the transformational portion of the full range model. There's 4 dimensions or factors. Idealized influence is the first, where this is this sense of idealized vision. There's some social utility in you doing whatever it is that I'd like for you to do. And there's also this emotional appeal, and it's about going beyond your own interest as an individual and doing something for the collective. So these 2 dimensions have a strong correlation or a high overlap with the charismatic leadership behaviors. Okay, what's new is this other column here where it gets into intellectual stimulation and individual consideration. Intellectual stimulation being this idea that you want your follower to be more creative, innovative, come up with new, interesting ideas, voice their opinion, and you support some type of constructive debate. It's not a top-down, you must do this because I said so. There is some degree of desire to create some constructive debate, constructive dialogue for better ideas. And then individual consideration. This is the idea that the transformational leader is genuinely trying to understand how to help and improve the lives, well-being, growth, development of their followers, right? So transformational leadership in terms of the full range model really made it very clear on, hey, this isn't enough. These idealized influence, inspirational motivation elements of charisma don't really tell the full story and may not have the same impact as transformational leadership that includes intellectual stimulation and individual consideration. Now, these 4 are likely to correlate at the moderate to high levels, but they're not necessarily 1 for 1, right? You're not always going to have an 8 out of 10 on all 4 of these. It could kind of fluctuate among them all. And you might even have scenarios where someone is very low on one of the 4, but they're very high on the other 3. So they're maybe 75% of the way there in terms of transformational leadership, right? It's a continuum. It's not a dichotomy of either or, right? And the degree to which they are more idealized, more inspirational, more intellectual stimulating, more individual consideration will then build on itself and has an additive effect. Transactional forms of leadership. The first one is contingent reward, and this is essentially the equivalent of transactional leadership as initially proposed in some of the Burns conceptualizations, where it is very much a transaction. You do this and I give you this. And then these other 2, they're kind of underneath the category of management by exception. There's 2 subcategories of active management by exception or passive management by exception. Active would be that all you're really doing is looking for issues. You're looking for mistakes, you're looking for violations, and then you correct them. You're not being proactive and trying to grow, help, develop, or anything like that. You're just looking for mistakes. And then passive is where you're not even looking for them. You just wait until they bubble up to the surface, and then you try and fix them. Okay, so you can see there's all sorts of different levels of involvement or proactive involvement in trying to figure out what's the right thing to do. And then the last one within the full range model is essentially a lack of leadership, non-leadership, and they call it laissez-faire. It's very hands-off. It is abdicating responsibility. It's delaying decisions, not being proactive and helping the follower figure out what's next, and not interested in the follower's needs. And some might make the argument, for example, that, hey, I'm not a micromanager. I let my employee do their thing. I'm here if they need me. I don't want to hover. But too much of that actually ends up being laissez-faire leadership, which is not good. The research is pretty clear that's not helpful. So that's another determination. And this was another novelty of the full range leadership model, where they were not just talking about forms of leadership, but they specified that there is such thing as a lack of leadership, right? Somebody that's supposed to be in that type of role, but is not. And so another important discussion, and we kind of hinted on this as we got through some of those content slides, is to keep in mind that all of these ratings of leadership are in the eyes of the beholder. And so I've done some debates before with students at the undergrad and the MBA level asking this specific question. 100 years from now, President Trump will be considered a leader. And it's really interesting to hear the responses, because a lot of times everyone can come up with arguments that would say, well, depends on what view I'm taking. If I'm talking about myself, I might say this. If I'm talking about this segment of the social strata, I might say this. Arguably, there are two or more. And essentially, the crux of the discussion is that you're all right. It really depends on who you are and what you're trying to consider, right? So there's certainly a portion of the population who would say President Trump is a transformational leader, because President Trump has specific morals and ideals that they believe in and that they think are important to get the country to whatever stage it needs to be in terms of becoming better and being great again, or whatever it might mean. And then there's also those that say, he's actually a pseudo-transformational leader. He's not doing this because he wants to help the country. The only reason he ran for president in the first place is because he wanted to increase his social capital and his status and his visibility. And there's good arguments there as well. And then also people can critique his behaviors and essentially say, he's trying to get people to do something, but in actuality, he's self-dealing, or he's helping those that are close to him or in his circle. So there's a third party essentially coming up with evidence to suggest, number 3, that it's pseudo-transformational leadership. And then almost everybody would have a hard time arguing that he's not transactional. Almost his platform was going into the election as being able to make a deal and make things better because of his business acumen. One of his popular books is The Art of the Deal, and talked about how he was going to renegotiate trade agreements and renegotiate the relationship with China. And so, coming at a relationship from that standpoint is very transactional. Right? So again, the purpose is to say it depends on who you are, right? All of these leadership scales can be rated by different parties. It might be their direct follower. It might be rated by their superior. It might be aggregated within a specific segment of the population, or it might be the entire population at large, right? So that's important to consider. And it's also important to consider that it could be more than one, right? They can be transformational as well as transactional. They can be transactional as well as pseudo-transformational. All right, the next thing I want to point out is that also there's this assumption, because transformational just sounds better than transactional. It sounds more important. It sounds more interesting. It sounds more uplifting to be transformational than transactional. But in fact, the research would illustrate in what are called meta-analyses that that's not always the case. So in this specific graph, what I'm showing you is the results of a meta-analysis that looked at the relationship between transformational leadership and 4 different outcomes, and then between contingent reward, which would be a stand-in for transactional leadership, given that it's one of the most popular dimensions of transactional leadership, on these different outcome variables. And so these correlations that you're looking at, 0.71, 0.55, 0.64, etc., are an aggregation of every study that has been published, and actually some that haven't been published, but data was collected on that people never got published in a journal. Aggregated all these hundreds, maybe even thousands of studies together and said, here's the relationship. And so interestingly, transformational leadership is better incrementally better than transactional leadership when the outcome variable of interest is follower satisfaction with the leader and this rating of leader effectiveness. So this subjective perception of the follower that the leader is effective or ineffective. And maybe that has something to do with the fact that we like leaders that are more uplifting and have this sense of ideology and have this sense of helping me grow and develop and wanting my feedback, etc. But interestingly, in terms of follower job satisfaction, which isn't the same thing as leader satisfaction, job satisfaction and their roles and their duties and their day-to-day responsibilities is higher for transactional leadership. Why might that be? Well, transactional leadership is very much about understanding, here's all the things I need to get done, and here's all the things that I want you to do, and here's how much time you have, and the deadlines, and okay, let's make this process an eye for an eye. You do this, and I give you this. So perhaps transactional leadership is more beneficial than transformational because it's more precise, it's more exacting. And then leader job performance, interestingly, is higher when it's transactional as opposed to transformational. And it's much higher, actually. It's the biggest difference in all of these four outcome variables. And this is different than leader effectiveness, and that leader job performance is an objective rating on some type of scale that is used within these organizations, right? So interestingly, perhaps people don't like transactional leaders as much, but they are more performance oriented and they actually get things done. Now, it could be short-term versus long-term interest type conversations. Sure, they get the most out of their employees, but in the long term, are the employees committed? Right? So you can see all sorts of arguments that illustrate that it just depends on the situation, on which one is better. All right, next we have an outline here of some of the strengths and criticisms, similar to what we do for the remainder of the modules. So one of the strengths of transformational leadership is that it is intuitive, and we understand that we want to be motivated and we like people that care about us, right? It's not anything too surprising in terms of leadership, and it's also broadly applicable. And you could say that transformational leadership is going to be applicable whether it's in an educational setting or a for-profit or a non-profit, right? Everybody is going to some degree enjoy working for a transformational leader. And then it's also process and interaction focused, meaning the process of why transformational leadership is leading to the dependent variable has been well studied. And it's also focused on the dyad. We talked about LMX in the Introduction to Leadership chapters. So it very much is, okay, what is going on inside the brain of the follower that's making them perceive that their leader is good based upon that relationship quality that they have. And then there's tons and tons of scientific support. Just as I showed that last meta-analysis slide with all of the different findings, there's been tons of research on transformational, transactional, the whole full range model, etc. Some of the criticisms, however, is, and this is relatively new, I would say, transformational leadership was super hot in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, and then a scathing article came out by a really, really popular leadership researcher who actually is now who is a chair of leadership at my alma mater where I got my PhD at Drexel, Van Kippenberg, where he said, look, transformational leadership is super vague. It is so vague that it essentially should be related to everything. And it's almost too broad to really have meaning. You know, you could argue that, this transformational leadership construct and the 4 I's in particular is so big and covers so many different buckets that it would be hard to find someone that didn't do at least some moderate degree of everything that you're seeing there. And they're so positive oriented, and when we evaluate them with some kind of positive outcome variable, we're really not seeing this huge effect that we think we should. So they make some good arguments in that, hey, transformational leadership, it's just too broad to mean anything. And then also there's this sense of what's called heroic leadership bias. And this is like similar to that trait theory perspective of the great man the great man theory, where you're born with a specific trait and you have this capability. Well, it still has some of that flavor to it, where it sounds like the hero is going to swoop in and change the day because they have this big vision and this big personality that's going to get people motivated to want to do the right thing. And we're seeing more and more leadership theories as of late that kind of get away from this heroic leadership mentality, and recognizing that that doesn't necessarily always fit or work well in all organizational settings. And it's also sometimes unpalatable for some of the more recent generations that are in the workforce. And then the last one is that it really does have the potential to be abused, specifically with the pseudo-transformational leadership construct. But interestingly, there hasn't been a lot of research on that, and we don't really understand how it's being abused or if it's being abused and to what degree. Okay, so those are the major highlights of the transformational leadership theory. You should pay attention to the evolution of charismatic leadership, to Burns's conceptualization that looked at transformational versus transactional versus pseudo-transformational. Then you should also understand these different dimensions of the full range model of leadership, where they talk about some of these in a little bit more specific terms, such as the 4 I's for transformational leadership, as well as contingent reward and some of the other dimensions within transactional leadership. Remember that it depends on who you are as to what you're going to rate these different leadership traits. Everybody's different and has different perceptions of what they think. It's also possible for somebody to be more than one of these different dimensions. You can be transactional as well as transactional at the same time. And then also, no leadership theory is perfect. Transformational leadership, super hot, super popular for a long period of time, but also its broadness and its applicability has also interestingly become its biggest weakness, and that it might not be specific enough to really help us understand what to do differently from a practical perspective when it comes to leadership. So that wraps up transformational leadership. Thanks so much.